Okay, welcome everyone. We've all had a good natter, we've had a bit of a drink, and there's a few new faces here, and everyone was sort of saying, oh, what normally happens? This is it. We relax, we drink, we eat, then we hear some very interesting guest speakers. And they'll tell us a bit about themselves, mainly related to the topic of the night, how it relates to them and their careers. And then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll throw the floor open. So anything you want to discuss with them, anything you want to ask out of the conversation, feel free. But we'll start off anyway. And by the way, happy International Women's Day to everybody. It's been a big day. Okay, and also I should say at the head of obviously all our meetings and everything that I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathering, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Okay, so tonight we have Karen Clark with us and Professor Leanne Robinson. So they're both going to be having a chat to you, with our topic being working in and with government to advance international aid and development. Always a bit of a hot topic, that one, working with government. Now we'll start, probably should start immediately to my left. Karen? Karen leads the ADDC, so that's the Australian Disability and Development Consortium. The ADDC is a collective voice working for inclusion of people with disabilities across Australian international development sector. So sharing expertise and advocacy to government. Yeah? So Karen's worked in the international development sector for over 15 years in the areas of advocacy, policy and project management throughout Asia and the Pacific. The start of your career could be seen, I think, not for the faint-hearted, quite frankly, working in an advocacy role that focused on survivor assistance for those who were injured by landmines and cluster munitions, and participating in developing the UN Convention on Cluster Munitions. Yeah? Not easy, I'm sure. And your work in this area continued with the Lao PDR and on programs supporting people with disabilities. Karen then worked with the Australian Red Cross, or still works with the Australian Red Cross, or used to work with the Australian Red Cross across the Pacific, which I'm sure a few of us know. We'll start with Karen. So Karen, I might just get you to give us a bit of an insight into your, I guess, the motivation or the pathway that you took in to get to your current role. So what was your pathway, I guess is what I'm getting at. How did you get onto it, and what sort of journey has it been for you?
Thank you. Well, first of all, happy International Women's Day, and how exciting is it to be here in person. This is my first event like this in over 2 years, so I'm excited to be here, so thanks for having me. So I guess my career has been like everyone's, a whole mixture of things, and as you said in the intro, I've worked in a few different countries and a few different roles, but I think like a lot of us, whether we realise it or not, most of us work in advocacy in international development, whether you're in a program and you're trying to support the people that work in country in the program to be able to work with their government or to work with their local communities. There's always an advocate role in it, I think, and supporting people to be able to come together and make decisions as a community and then conveying them to their local government, or it could be working with a local office and then taking what their needs are back to your organisation based in Australia. So there's many different aspects of it. At the moment, I'm the Executive Officer for the Australian Disability and Development Consortium, so ADDC. A couple of people I know here are members, but if you haven't heard of it, basically we're a collective voice for calling for more disability inclusion within the Australian Aid program. So we work with Australian sector organisations to support them to do disability inclusion, but one of our key focuses is on the Australian government. That is always a journey in itself, trying to work with such a huge organisation to try and influence on one particular topic. I started in advocacy, well, the first time was when I was 16, and it wasn't to do with international development, it was to do with working with a chronic illness program. And then from there, I actually have done 2 years of volunteering. So the first was with the Uniting Church in their social justice unit, and that's where I learned about landmines, cluster munitions, unexploded ordnance, which all have in common a nature of being indiscriminate, and once deployed, if they're not exploded during the war, then they can have many, many decades and decades violence and disruption and injury and death caused on civilians. So a lot of my work then really focused on that and the forming of the UN Convention on Cluster Munitions and going to the meetings, and in my young 20s, trying to actually be a strong advocate was always a challenge, feeling like almost to that imposter syndrome, which is so young, feeling like, what do I know? Even though I came from a background of it, I'd studied it. And then from there was very much, had done some work in Laos, but was very much drawn to Laos. It's a country that is still classed as the most bombed per capita, and has an unfortunate history of a lot of cluster munitions. So large bomb that breaks into small explosive parts and then indiscriminately explodes, or a third of them generally do not explode and then cause havoc because people can't use their land. They still injure people to the day, and these were dropped in the Vietnam War in the 70s. And there, a lot of my role was program management, but also supporting people to be advocates. And I think for me, that's the favourite part of all of my work, is working with people to amplify their voice. So one of the initiatives there was called Ban Advocate, and they were survivors. It's an initiative by HI that wasn't just in Laos, but I was involved in the Laos section, where Laos survivors were given the skills to be able to tell their story, tell the impact of cluster munitions. And then we were able to provide them opportunities to talk to embassies, to talk to donors, to try and direct funding into projects, for them to talk to their communities and other communities, to talk to the Lao government so that there was more attention put on the issue. I think those are the moments where you bring two people or a group of people together, that light bulb moment happens. The last big one of these that I remember is when there was a meeting that brought a whole lot of regional leaders from organisations of people with disabilities to Melbourne. And the Australian government, back in 2019, was reviewing their international aid policy. And so through a lot of phone calls and quite a lot of pestering, managed to get the people in DFAT who were running those consultations about what Australia should put in their next international development policy together in a room with these leaders of regional organisations of people with disabilities from the Asia Pacific. And obviously there was a lot of background work, but the meeting went for 2 hours and I barely had to say anything, which I feel like is a real success from my point of view, is that they had this amazing conversation, and you could see, and from feedback afterwards from the DFAT personnel that were there, they were like, we're starting to really understand why you keep talking to us about this issue and saying you need to include people with disabilities and you need to write it down. It needs to be strong, it has to be in a policy, and you need to fund that policy and that work. So there's a lot more to that story, but hopefully that's a little bit of a glimpse on what drives me and some things that I've done in my career.
Okay. So do you find it, I mean, I know the answer to this because we all find it, but in those dealings, like, having to go to the government, go to DFAT or go to the Australian government, I find it incredibly frustrating in terms of, even though you found they were actually quite responsive, frustrating preparing and going through that process to advocate for your cause, and the responses you actually get, and having to explain yourself continually about what you might consider a fairly obvious good cause, as it were, that deserves supporting and deserves government support. What are the levels of frustration like in terms of how hard is it to get their ear, as it were, normally, even if they were receptive to us?
Yeah. Very hard, I guess. You know the answer? Yeah,
I knew the answer.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, it's very cyclical. So 2019, we started talking to the Australian government saying, hey, your policy called Development for All that covers disability inclusion within the Australian aid program, it's about to expire. How about you commit to doing a new one? And then that was what part of those consultations I spoke about were about as well, the review of the aid program, but also this hopefully driving this new policy. And then when we had the ear of the minister as well, we had a meeting with the minister, and then, which was then Minister Hawke, and then he left his role, changing minister, we had a change in the DFAT, so the disability section within DFAT, which was obviously our key point of collaboration. The personnel basically has all changed, and they took a year to be able to get people into those positions. So a new minister, a whole new group of people to work within DFAT, and absolutely you're going back to square one, because you can't guarantee that the ministers even considered disability inclusion before. And then you have to start again. So I sometimes feel like the activities that we do to get attention, like writing a letter that gets signed by 20 of the organisations across the sector to say, hey, this is a key issue for all of us. You just do it again. And then you feel like you do it again. So you kind of quite cyclical, and that can really be frustrating as well.
So do you, I think one of the things that occurred to me was that, is it also then hard in terms of your advocacy, going to government in terms of the other advocates you might be competing with? You know, I mean, the Australian government dollars will, as they keep telling us, will only go so far, especially in terms of aid and development. And everybody wants some and everybody needs some, and they're all perfectly justifiable and valid causes. How do you find that in terms of how much do you know, how hard is it in you're competing for those dollars and for the attention of the people you're speaking to in government?
Yeah, I mean, one of our clear messages, and this little word new, so it's like, we want new money towards this.
Yes.
Please do not fund this disability inclusion strategy and take money out of a gender program.
Yes.
It's like, it's not either or, it's both.
Yeah.
And so then the conversation, which I'm sure everyone who works in development has been having over the past few years, is with shrinking resources. How do you meet then the needs of not just women, people with disabilities, women with disabilities, but then you have a whole lot of other marginalised groups. And so it's being quite clear in our communication, saying actually, this is, you're not taking from this bucket to move to this one, we're talking about new money. And we want money restored, and we don't want it directed.
And what's their response to that normally? Because they're just notorious from taking from one bucket to put in the other.
They are. And they like to hide it, don't they, on budget night?
They like to make themselves seem so generous. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry, but it's just moving the pieces on the board.
That's why there's a group of us on budget night staring at what's being released, being like, is this new money? Is it really new money, or is it really just being taken here and they haven't quite said it? Look, it's varying. So I think depending on who's in power as well, in terms of the government, depends on how much aid money there is. We know that there's trends. And so I think DFAT over the past few years, in my experience, has been very conservative in what they could expect into their budget. Because obviously the disability section in DFAT wants more money into their budget. They're like, we don't have enough to be able to do the things that we consider vital in being disability inclusive, and Australia's role globally to drive it in. And so they're like, yeah, absolutely. So we collaborate with them as well on letting them know what we're doing. But yeah, a lot of the time it's like, well, no, you're just not going to get that money. And so it's like, all right, well, we're not going to stop asking. This is still an issue.
And that's the thing, they probably know there's not a lot you can do, but you'll just keep coming back knocking on their door. Just out of interest, in terms of, I mean, I don't want to seem ignorant here, in terms of does the Australian government still have a policy and perhaps an active program in terms of areas like Laos and Cambodia and stuff in terms of landmines? Do we still have an active, is there still a level of demining as it used to be in terms of landmines still existing in the countries, and do we support programs that help, you know, follow that up? What's happening with landmines still? I
only know part of the answer, so maybe someone else in the room has before, because it's not really an area that I work in right now. But certainly, yes, clearance is still happening. So clearance in Laos, when I left 10 years ago now, I lived there for 5 years and then left 10 years ago, it was going to take upwards of 3 decades at the rate it was going to just clear the land that would be used by people. So we're not talking about deep forests. We were talking about land that perhaps agricultural land could be used as a school and the like, or as a road. So that was going to take 3 decades, right? And that was all external funded. Whether the Australian government was a major donor into it, whether they still are, I actually don't know. Their
it's interesting, isn't it? I guess that's the other thing with issues like that, where certain topics go out of the spotlight a bit, and not necessarily the favoured ones move more into the shadows. So then it's a question of, are they getting the same attention and the same dollars? Obviously not, I would suggest.
Yeah, I would suggest.
No. Okay, has anyone got a quick 1 or 2 questions? for Karen, and then we'll move on to Leanne, and then we're going to open up the floor after Leanne's spoken as well to everyone who has questions. Anyone got a question?
In terms of working with government, and you obviously and understandably talk about working with DFAT, is there other areas of the Australian government that you found yourself working with? You know, are you involved in, do you have discussions with different ministries or anything like that, or is it purely just DFAT focused?
So for us, working with our focus really is, and we try to just keep it as narrow as this, it's aid program and disability inclusion. So predominantly, yeah, it's DFAT, and working across DFAT, so not just speaking with the disability section, but working with a whole range of others, like trying to find ways to have good conversations, like really fruitful conversations with the office, for instance. Yeah. But it is very much DFAT. In previous roles, I've worked across FAMES.
Sorry, what is your background in government?
Kind of policy. So I did my undergraduate, and it was an arts degree from Melbourne, majoring in development studies. So they had, development studies was in their human geography, I don't know if it still is, department, and it wasn't kind of a full degree that you could do yet. It was kind of just before that started. So I did that, and then did a year of volunteering, which was really, I feel like in my career I've learned a lot more on the job. So, and I've been really fortunate as having people who've managed me who have been willing to teach me as I go. So that first year of volunteering, I learned a lot about advocacy and how you put your pace and how you actually develop. And it's not just going and talking to someone, it's about having a real strong evidence base behind what you're doing. So making sure it's really well researched, that you're connecting with the communities, that really lives you're trying to actually affect. So it was that, and then I did do a master's in international development at RMIT, and I did that mostly one subject a semester while I was working, particularly while I was living overseas, as a way to get some kind of professional input in. I felt quite isolated in what I was doing, so it gave me that connection back to the theoretical behind what we do, and trying to think through some of the also the ethical issues that you come across that are hard when you're embedded in a program.
We might talk about that after. I'll introduce Leanne shortly. I was just thinking we might actually talk about that in terms of how much of your work, and a few of us who work in the sector or have worked overseas and stuff would attest to this as well, how much of the work you actually do learn more on the job and on the ground and in country. Absolutely. Than you do in just learning about this and doing courses and stuff. Okay, so we'll move on to Leanne. So Professor Leanne Robinson. So Leanne's in the area of health. So for more than 17 years, she's got more than 17 years experience in research, leading a program of multidisciplinary research and health systems, strengthening activities to support and control the elimination of tropical infectious diseases. You've probably had a fun 2 years. No, we don't have to touch on COVID. I won't even mention Japanese encephalitis. So we don't want to go there either. You've worked in Papua New Guinea in PNG for more than 16 years, and you lived in Madang for 8 years, which must be really interesting. Leanne's a program director of health security and pandemic preparedness at the Burnett Institute, with positions also ranging from work with PNG Institute of Medical Research through to Monash University, through to the World Health Organization and Global Health Advisory Committees. So seriously, if you have got any questions for Leanne, I suggest she could probably answer them. So her program has strong links to national and provincial disease control programs. Much of your work, I gather, has directly informed policy and scale up through partnership-based systems and strengthening approach, which is all very good development speak for saying she knows about working with partners and government and everyone else. So Leanne, if you'd like to tell us a bit about your career and how busy you've obviously been, and your pathway in terms of getting there and how you deal, whether you're internally, like in government, or dealing with governments to get things done.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. Happy International Women's Day, and it is really lovely to see people in the real, as I feel like we call it now. Like Jill said, I mean, I guess probably somewhat different to many of you here. You know, I am an immunologist and epidemiologist by background, but I've really spent the best part of the last 17 years working, you know, with communities, health programs and governments in lower middle income countries. And spent 8 years living and working on the north coast of Papua New Guinea with my husband and our 2 kids and our 3 dogs, and sort of, you know, really being part of the community and understanding through that, you know, really what are some of the key priorities and challenges that we need to address for infectious diseases research to actually accelerate control and elimination. And I guess that's really where probably, you know, I think it's a really great kind of link in a way, my more classical training in sort of the research and the science sort of met that very real world, you know, development reality, and have really spent most of my career doing a lot more of that in terms of really working with communities and partners on the ground to find the best way to actually implement the tools that we have now for malaria in particular, but also other infectious diseases, and then prioritise like what are the evidence gaps, what are the new tools, the research that we need, and then how can we best inform the development of those so that they are suitable to communities, they are acceptable, they will have high uptake. I mean, I promised I wouldn't talk about COVID, but I think, you know, I'm sure you're all aware of the incredibly low uptake of COVID-19 vaccination in Papua New Guinea. And I think, you know, it's a really good example of what happens when something is not developed with enough time, organically enough with the community, for them not only to understand what this brand new disease is, but how we could possibly have an effective vaccine for it in the time frame we had. So I feel like that sort of insight and being able to understand the societal and cultural understanding of infectious diseases has really shaped my entire program of work from that stage on. And I guess, I mean, I was thinking about, you know, really how to describe my journey to where I've got to tonight. And I think it's because I've done really a bunch of different things, you know, from doing my honours on like an incredibly rare genetic syndrome called Hutchinson-Gilford-Progeria syndrome, to working in a refugee settlement in West Africa in Woodaboroom, to then completing my PhD and sort of deciding to go and spend that length of time in Papua New Guinea. It's really been all the time not a case of deciding, you know, that I want to do that. I want to kind of, you know, there's these two choices, but just really being underpinned by this desire to have the most impact on health that I really feel like I can have with my skills and my expertise and my approach. And I think every time I've, you know, come across those decisions in my life, which sometimes do get presented to you, or maybe even you present them to yourself as like I have to choose this or I have to choose this, like I'm either on that pathway or I'm on that pathway. I think I've just gone, well, I don't have to. I can mix this up and I can pick the best bits of this and put them together to really do what I would like to achieve. And I feel like that's really what I did in terms of, you know, embarking on a PhD in the immunology of malaria, whilst at the same time doing an MPH, because I was really convinced that studying the immunology of malaria wasn't going to solve malaria. So I thought I would just sort of do both things and work out how I could have the most influence. And realizing that there really is a place for all of those things, but it does come back to advocacy. And I think, you know, and even in an earlier seminar we had today, you know, sometimes it was flagged, you know, that we like to, as scientists, perhaps particularly, maybe less so as development practitioners, kind of separate ourselves from politics. But science is politics, and an incredibly important part of science is advocacy. And it's advocacy to government for funding in many of the same ways that you just described, you know, to convince the government to adequately fund the National Health and Medical Research Council work, but more so to convince governments to set aside a decent enough portion of their foreign aid budget, you know, for health and medical priorities in the region, and how to support them with making those investments in a way that are actually meaningful on the ground, and not just infrastructure development programs that can be tagged as being, you know, health and medical research support. And so I think for me, I absolutely learned all of that on the job as well. You know, I you know, yes, of course, I did a master's in public health, and you know, there's some of the training, you know, involved in that certainly, you know, helped me understand the theoretical backgrounds of aid funding for health, but really it was being on the ground for all of that time that sort of underpinned my approach. And I guess it is really, you know, if I reflect on what I think is sort of, you know, those areas of my work or my program of work where I've been able to have the most impact on government, whether that be at the very local community level in Papua New Guinea, where, you know, every village has a village council that really does govern, you know, that village's involvement in different activities, to the Papua New Guinea government, to DFAT investments, is by actually being able to take, you know, that really partnership-based approach of being able to bring people together and help amplify. I feel like it's exactly that same message that you hit on so beautifully, like amplify the voices of others, because it is, you know, the health workers, the doctors, the community members of the countries that I work with actually know what some of the gaps are in terms of the delivery of quality health services. They know how they could do this well if they had enough time to plan it, if they had enough health workforce to deliver it, if they had enough forward-thinking funding to plan that well. But they're rarely, if ever, given that opportunity, either by their own governments or by, you know, DFAT in terms of their foreign aid investment portfolio. So, you know, I think we have definitely taken that approach with our program of work. So, you know, obviously I lead the health security program at the Burnett Institute, but also a really committed, quite multidisciplinary team of researchers around malaria, neglected tropical diseases, but who are really working with communities and government in that way to really follow very genuine principles of developing a shared vision for this program of work. Like, what do you want it to achieve before we even go and try and convince DFAT in Canberra or DFAT Post in PNG that we should fund this, you know, malaria program of work, whatever it might be. What do you want it to achieve? How can your expertise combined with our expertise actually combine, you know, to produce something that will really meaningfully draw upon everybody's comparative strength to actually do something that we couldn't do if we were working alone. And so, you know, I think really through that, we've grown a fairly large program of work in malaria, arbovirus, including Japanese encephalitis, surveillance in Papua New Guinea. And it's really been an approach that I think both DFAT Post in Port Moresby and Canberra have really appreciated. It very much resonated what you said about that effort that went into that meeting, you know, to get everybody in the room for 2 hours. You know, I feel like there's been a few of those occasions over the last 5 years even, where I could sort of pinpoint have been absolutely pivotal in sort of just like those penny drop moments where you suddenly see in that team that you've been working with, and it could be the DFAT government team, it could actually be the PNG government team as well, where they've suddenly understood, oh, okay, like this is how we need to work together to get this outcome. Like, I've always thought it was just about this, or I've always thought it was just about this. But, you know, and we had a similar kind of event several years ago now, called the Malaria World Congress, and it took a lot of time and effort and energy to convince the right people from government to come to that event and actually dedicate serious chunks of time to engage with leaders from the region, you know, and actually it was almost exactly what you just described. And all the effort that went into it, once we were there, you know, I think everybody was fairly stressed, but it was like we didn't have to do anything because the event itself just took care of itself, because those conversations, once you get people together who understand the priorities and a system of funding that I feel like has changed, and I'd be interested in other perspectives on that actually from people in the room, you know, around sort of country-led approaches to implementing development. You know, I mean, it's still not where it needs to be, but in terms of the way, certainly that many of the DFAT investments in health have been made over the last 5 years, there's been a huge shift in the right direction to really understanding priorities of local stakeholders, local leaders, and investing in the right areas of those programs. That for me is very motivating and inspiring. Not to say that it doesn't, you know, still present a huge challenge to ensure that you have everybody on the same page. But yeah, I mean, I think it really is through that approach, I guess, that a lot of our work has been able to generate the insights that change policy. You know, we listened to the disease control program in saying that there's absolutely no way we can implement 5 annual rounds of a mass drug administration program every single year to clear this particular infectious disease. Like, we can't afford that. It's not logistically feasible in our setting. We need something better. And, you know, those kinds of conversations a decade ago sparked a whole program of research and funding from the Gates Foundation that was all aimed towards coming up with a better treatment regime, a more efficient approach to delivering treatment to communities in less rounds, in a less amount of time, that would cost less and enable a greater impact on health and improving health. And so, I mean, I think like they can be big picture examples, but ultimately it's hitting on, in our field of work at least, those areas where the demand from the community meets the interests of government to actually have a big impact, that I think you can really change policy and progress things.
Okay, I have a couple of questions off the back of that, but given what you just said, I'll put this one first. You just mentioned the Gates Foundation. So given that they're known, obviously, globally for their philanthropy, especially around health issues, do you find, or have you found, having a third, be it philanthropic or whatever it is, having a third entity, a third partnership or another partnership helping you with the government negotiations, be it PNG and or DFAT negotiations, has been a huge help, let alone the financial side of it. But in terms of negotiating and trying to move forward and get things done, having that, be it an NGO or a philanthropic entity, does that help, and in a major way?
Yeah, I think it helps. It can hinder.
I mean, more in the discussions with the government entities as well, not just from the financial side.
So I think in countries, it can both help and hinder. I think in terms of getting more support and traction with Australian government, with DFAT, I mean, even with, you know, Big Health and things like that, it really helps. Yeah. Like, if they can see that there's already investment and sort of momentum, and they're kind of coming to the party rather than being the ones that have to stick their neck out and say, yes, let's make a party here. You know, then so much easier to convince them. I think in country, it's always, I find, still a very careful line between things being pushed on countries from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, global funds, DFAT, you know, global donors,
can still be met with skepticism and just lack of trust, I think. But the funding itself is always helpful if it meets the sweet spot of what the demand and the priority and the program that a local team really want to implement. Then it's obviously great.
So the being in health, obviously, it's such a massive topic in development. There's no way you can actually implement or achieve, I would imagine, your programs or projects that you need to work on specifically without government input. It's not like some of maybe the smaller development issues in development sector where they might be able to take off and use, say, a philanthropic organisation and a couple of NGOs and maybe go and do it off with just a bit of negotiating within country governments. You'd actually have to have the input of both, say, DFAT or MFAT if it's in New Zealand, and the in-country government like PNG government. That's the case, isn't it? You can't avoid having those talks with government.
No, absolutely not. I mean, especially not with a program like kind of the size and scale of what we implement. As you say, I think depending on the particular niche area, in certain areas of health research, there might be smaller things that can be done, in the margins that make sweet spots. But for areas like malaria, COVID, and neglected tropical diseases, I mean, it's absolutely required everybody to be able to come to the table and be very transparent about what they want out of it. I think that was one of the biggest lessons still for me in 2020 when DFAT were really having some issues trying to work out how we were pressuring them to invest more in Papua New Guinea, to prevent the inevitable outbreak and spread of COVID-19, but really finding it difficult to understand how they could do that more than they already were, like without kind of the requests, the bilateral sort of politics can be very difficult. Whereas I think that's actually as NGOs and development organisations and medical research partners, we can be incredibly helpful at bringing people to the table to say, well, here's the need, here's the priority that's been identified by in-country partners to do X, Y, and Z. That will deliver you this. Like there you have it. So I feel like often we're also playing a really important bridging role in, again, bringing people to the table just so that they can not, have to be navigating that process purely government to government can sometimes be more difficult than government to government with a whole bunch of NGOs and health research organisations at the table. That's out.
And as you say, and as Karen pointed out, as you agreed, was that a lot of it's about advocacy. So when you said, you might actually find, as you have found, that if you, with the PNG government, for instance, if you go to them and finally you can see the pennies dropped and they understand it, and that's a great hurdle to get over. It's also then what happens next? They have to deliver that messaging to the community. Do they ask you to then partner with them and help them in delivering those messages to try and get the right and the clear message out? Because we know a massive problem is obviously misinformation, or especially around health issues. How does that work in terms of is that a normal part, or particularly with COVID in PNG as an example, has that been an extra thing that you would do?
No, I mean, I guess that's a normal part, is really, again, as a group of organisations with, again, WHO involvement as well, really sitting around and working out, who is best placed in their area of expertise with their local connections on the ground in a given country or in a given part of the country to actually deliver this particular part of a program. It's working out, what the overall program is, but then within that, who is best placed to deliver what. And again, I would find if those sorts of conversations are being led by in-country governments and their provincial health programs and stakeholders, it becomes much easier to very quickly agree on what a funding envelope should look like and who should do what, because they're part of that decision making to really decide, well, we already work with you on that. So it would be very easy to just integrate this whole COVID vaccination, health information program as part of this TV outreach work that you're already doing, for example. So
yeah, it must be hard. I mean, I know for a fact, and those of us who have worked overseas, especially in the Pacific and that, but have worked, it's that changing of minds, no matter how much the government agrees and how much you try and deliver it. It's that changing of mindsets, especially, and PNG is a classic example over this COVID issue in terms of, by the time you get misinformation and superstition and, they still punish witches and for witchcraft in PNG. So, so there's a lot of that goes on. Did it help you in terms of having actually worked there for a long time, but even living in Madang, in that province and stuff? Did that help in some ways in understanding and helping the government in that way? Or again, was that something that wasn't necessarily a factor?
I think it was still very difficult with COVID. It's just been incredibly difficult to keep up with where communities are at in their understanding of how much of a threat or not, this pathogen is, and identifying the best ways to, it's not even to build trust, but just to give the correct information through trusted voices and ensure that that's really happening. So I'm sure it helped, but not in I think like really concrete ways, more just by understanding that this was a huge leap of faith we were asking people to take. And I think having that lens on the whole situation helped in discussions. But yeah,
I think also in terms of mindsets, especially in terms of the way the Pacific communities think, I've found it interesting through this COVID thing is that Samoa is one of the Pacific countries that has the highest vaccination rates, I'm sure, is purely because they went through measles, which they had no vaccines for and had not had experience of 3 months before COVID broke out, and saw that horrible level of deaths of children. And I'm sure they don't want to get into it again. So it's sort of like, even if it's not about mindset change, they've experienced that in a very small, very quick, very devastating manner, and they know what's coming. So there has been very little hesitancy in Samoa, from what I've gathered, in terms of getting vaccinated. And it's sort of like you want that mindset to go around the Pacific, but you think it's not going to happen. The reason Samoa is doing it is because they had that terrible experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And they had built really strong systems through that as well, in terms of working out how their population really wanted to be vaccinated, and so really took a very different approach to what has been taken in some other settings, of really going door to door and equipping. And they had a health workforce that they could equip to do that fairly quickly because of the prior measles outbreak. So I mean, they, I think, were fairly fortunate. But I mean, other Pacific Island countries have done similarly well, really, when you look at Fiji and the like, and eventually getting to that same level of uptake. So I think it's very context dependent. And
it is very context dependent and can be very frustrating. I know at this very moment, Vanuatu's just started an outbreak. They've had their first community cases over the last 2 days, and the government is doing nothing but chasing its tails. So it does not look good for the next week or so, I'm afraid. Sorry, that's a personal note, because I lived in Vanuatu and obviously still do work with them. All right, so for both of you, has the nature, before we break up, I'd like to get everyone to ask questions that they might have. I'm just curious, has the nature of aid and development in itself, do you think over time, over the course of your careers, changed from a government perspective? I mean, I know you mentioned they have been more positive in recent years towards advocacy for disability, and that's great. I always get very cynical, wonder if there's an agenda going on, but there's an election coming up, but various things. Have you noticed over the years you've dealt with governments, especially the Australian government, obviously for us, has there been a change in the attitudes, apart from the classic, lessening and lessening of funding, about aid and development, what purpose it serves and how they see their role in serving, and how organisations and the work you guys do facilitate?
Look, I think it depends on what area as well you're looking at. I mean, when you look at the aid sector and how and who is delivering the aid now compared to 10 years ago, the Australian ODA, so the actual money, there's a lot more managing contractors and a lot of big contractors. So a lot of big, so it's not so much that, and you look at the pool that, see your ANC people, so your pool that's generally for NGOs, and how the trend of that over the past 10 years as well. And I think that with the Australian government, when you have when it was growing, it was like, we've got this huge amount of money. How are we going to spend it? Let's spend it in big chunks.
Yeah.
And then, then what you go is, okay, well, how then are you going to do things like touched on with a localization agenda, which is definitely where the theory and a lot of organizations are going globally with development, and he's saying that actually it needs to be based in the countries. It needs to be driven by the countries, by the community. We've been saying it a long time, but now we really need to shift that. So I think there is a tension there with how do you spend so much money, managing contractors and large organizations, and also work and have it driven at the community level and the local government level, and be able to be as responsive as what you were talking about within the health programs as well. So I think absolutely there's been changes, and the decreasing aid then means that there was a decrease, a huge shift for those who were around in those ages, that age we went from AusAid to just within DFAT, and that the sheer loss of expertise from the government bureaucracy that was delivering aid from that was in AusAid and had been built up over many years to DFAT was massive.
Yeah.
And so while some of that is still there, and some of the people that we have contact with in DFAT are passionate about what they do and want to drive it, they're still working within a huge bureaucracy. And there's a lot of tensions, and as you said before, a lot of people vying for a decreasing bucket of money. So yeah, I think there's definitely, it's going to be interesting to see what happens after this election, and whoever comes into power, what happens. Because when you look at the latest trends in the Australian public, it's over recent years, it's definitely been decreasing in support of Australian aid. During COVID, it went up. Yeah. And so now there's an increasing trend to support Australian aid. I want Australia to be supporting our neighbours through aid. And so that's an interesting trend that is going to see where that goes, and whether that can also shift the government into giving more in aid and doing it more in a way that is really more community and local driven.
And of course, as you say, with an election coming up, I'm sure there'll be promise of more money and there'll be promise of change, but whether that actually comes to fruition or not when the election's all done will be another thing. Has anyone got questions for either Leanne or Karen? Anyone got questions on what we've discussed? Yes, sorry.
So my question is to both of you, either of you. Having worked with the PNG government nearly a decade ago now, just realised that as I was formulating this question. As a young woman, but a woman generally working, I mean, it's not exclusive by any means to PNG government, but it's obviously a very traditional patriarchal society. What advice would you give, or how did you navigate being a woman, a young woman, working, trying to work with governments that don't necessarily recognise your expertise or your authority as they might in other places?
I'm happy to start. And then I think what I've always found really helpful is drawing upon my technical expertise in those discussions, being incredibly, I'm a listener in government discussions, especially with PNG government, in terms of understanding exactly, where whoever I'm meeting or talking to is coming from. Their experience of the problem is likely to be quite different to mine, and understanding that, but then being able to help address it by drawing on my technical expertise, and really quite clearly always using that as a point of leverage, to the point that I might even refer to it several times in a conversation if I feel like I need to, in order to actually garner the respect that's needed to ensure that it's an effective conversation, not because I actually want to do that, but if I feel like it's not getting us anywhere because there's a lack of respect, I will draw on that again and again and again to demonstrate how, my expertise and skills in this area could actually, help to inform that or help them unlock that. I mean, I think something Karen mentioned before as well, which I think has always been, incredibly, and we've got a health economist in the room, is, being able to help them to understand, also that we can bring that sort of expertise to their problems of balancing what are incredibly resource constrained health budgets, and being able to indicate that with evidence, they've got more of an opportunity to actually be able to not necessarily take from that bucket and, add to that but actually lobby for more funding for this particular area on the basis of evidence of need from their local setting. So I've always found that to be an effective strategy, and have to say, I mean, it's not that there hasn't been difficult moments in sort of many of those relationships and working, you know, PNG can be a very male-dominated culture at that level, but I've never found it to be an actual obstacle to getting a project going or through or approved, so long as I've drawn on my network and expertise in that space to bring it to bear in a way that will help them.
Yeah, I think my experience is similar in the fact that in order to be able to jump over a hurdle of just being seen, particularly when I started doing the advocacy around the UN Convention on Cluster Munitions and I was in my early 20s, to be taken seriously and the same, to basically know your stuff. So
especially on such a serious subject.
Yeah, and I found that I had to actually basically argue my case in a way that said that actually you should listen to me and then try and get people to listen to you, which as an advocate and someone coming from a civil society perspective talking to government is a challenge anyway, but absolutely. I mean, I've been in meetings with Australian government ministers who basically have belittled me and reduced it, trying to reduce it to the conversation of the clothes I'm wearing, literally to the clothes I'm wearing. And I'm like, I'm not here to talk to you about that. I don't really care. Unfortunately, it's just me, you and your advisor, and you're making me really uncomfortable. Yeah. But, you know, I have your ear and I want to talk to you about disability inclusion. And so I think, yeah, absolutely, there's things like that. I remember jumping back to when I was in my early 20s, I had never worn heels before, but I actually started wearing heels to these conferences because literally the conversation was happening here.
Yes.
Because somehow all these people were really tall and it was mostly men. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to start wearing heels because then at least I'm a little bit taller and feel like I'm in the conversation rather than people talking over your head. And then the last thing I'd say about it is that working in Laos was a real eye-opener. I feel like in Australia sometimes it wasn't so much of an issue, but working in Laos, that is a very heavy patriarchal society, and absolutely felt like I had to prove myself. And similar to what you're saying, what I was showing my expertise in a way with one of the main projects where I worked very closely with the Lao government was facilitating funding and that relationship with the donor. And in the end, that was kind of my strength. It was like, that's what I bring. I'm the one who is basically the one who communicates and translates what we do to these 10 donors. Yeah. And that funds our project and funds all the additional money that all the government workers get.
So you were their access to money, so they pretty much shouldn't upset you.
In a way, it was, yeah. But there's also power that comes with that and responsibility. Yeah. And so it's a tension that you hold about making sure you do it responsibly.
Did you, I mean, I'm working on the assumption that Leanne is very fluent in Tok Pisin, so I would think after all your time living there, did you have to learn Laos?
I tried. I couldn't speak much of it now. No. But yeah, certainly I tried. I mean, obviously that's just a sign of respect, isn't it? You go into a country, no matter who you are, to learn some of their language.
That's what I was going to say in terms of, you know, for those who are thinking or are thinking about that question and the sort of thing you can do when you're in negotiations or as a woman in the room, and that it's the little things that in terms of showing respect depending on what culture and what community you're in, whether you're speaking to government, whether you're speaking to other NGOs here. So language is a big thing. If you know the language of the country and you can communicate in that language, that earns you a huge amount of respect usually. So like I say, you obviously would be very fluent in Tok Pisin.
But and I was thinking as you were talking as well, it's also, and I mean, maybe this, I don't know, it doesn't sound great, but it's also giving them bits of information they can use, like again, but becoming useful by being able to deliver like packages of bite-sized grabs that they can then use to make themselves seem incredibly knowledgeable and, you know, proficient at their job, even though maybe they're not. But, you know, if you can do that, as however wrong perhaps it might be, or, you know, it actually can really help, you know, develop a relationship that becomes more than that, because again, they just respect the knowledge and expertise that you actually bring to the partnership to then be able to progress it together. So I've also found that really helpful, identifying exactly what bits of knowledge would help them and give it.
But basically just some capacity building for their part that they can take away from that. Okay. Any other questions? Yep.
I was involved with them a long time, and we kept getting called asking for more money and asking them, well, if you're in this state, if that having paid being more amounts, how does that achieve that? And it sounds like actually
look, it's a good question, and it's something that we discuss regularly with DFAT, which is from the information we have, it looks like over the past 5 years, DFAT has significantly reducing their investment in disability inclusion across mainstream programs. That's the information I have. And then DFAT goes, oh no, but that's not true. It's like, okay, well, that's great, but can you just show me? Show me the figures. Can you show me the data that that's not true? And they're like, oh, okay, well, we can't. It's like, well, it needs to be transparent. And so I think something that we've seen recently, and it's always difficult, but there's certainly a downward trend in seeing that kind of reporting around the aid program. I mean, we haven't seen a performance of Australian aid report. The last one was 2017-18.
Really?
And so there is country level reporting against partnerships for recovery, but it's not that big detail. And one of them is getting them to bring it back. Yeah, because we want to see where it's going. We want to see how it's directed. And with all those cross-cutting issues, how can you track it? Yeah. And so there's definitely ways in which we're advocating for them to do it in disability inclusion with different markers. But yeah, definitely need more transparency.
So why do you think there's been that drop in reporting? Because there were programs, I mean, I know I work in the sport for development sector, and disability inclusion from 2017 was a big push by DFAT in terms of the programs we were doing across the Pacific. It became part of, we had to do cluster positionings, and whether you were doing health, whether you were doing other things, my things with media and comms, whatever, there was a disability factor. There were a lot of people went out with disability inclusion as their project role, if you like. And it still is, it's still happening. Disability inclusion has become a very big part of a couple of the projects we're doing. So I'm surprised, we are doing massive reporting for them, it's nuts filling in those reports. So I'm surprised there's no sort of actual overall reporting since 2017 or data that they can give you, because they're certainly collecting it.
I think they're probably, yeah.
So they won't give you, they don't say why that's happening, they just don't have the staff. They're not putting together the reports. Or
I think part of it is staffing for disability inclusion. I mean, I think it's the systems across a very big bureaucracy. It's investing the time into pulling all that data together and making sure it's accurate. Because they don't want to put out something that's not accurate. So as to why the trend, I think there's many guesses. I mean, there's just been a downward trend in general in aid, hasn't there? So I don't know what they'll focus on, the information that's given.
Interesting. Okay. Any other questions? Any thoughts? Anyone want to make comments about what they've heard tonight? No, we're good. Quite a bunch. You ladies, right? Anything else you wanted to add?
Not really. I mean, I had a couple of other points. I mean, I think that we've almost just hit on them really then around, for me, mentoring has been an incredibly big part of what I've done over the last, especially sort of 10 years in PNG, really working not just with a focus on, delivery of outputs and health outcomes, but how can this be embedded within organisations and people to create sustainability and again, just finding the right ways to do that. So, I mean, I think mentoring is so important of ourselves, but also, how much we do of others in all our relationships and with all our partnerships, to me is an incredibly important part and probably almost the most enjoyable part, I feel like, of what I do. Probably doesn't ever, get perhaps much reward in terms of, you know, some of the actual, but it's what I love doing, and ultimately is what delivers the sustainability of funding, and so it's just so important. I mean, I think the only other thing to reflect on, especially given it is International Women's Day, is just, you know, the juggle and the balance that we all have to strike in these kinds of careers, with children and having children, and, you know, being open to what that means, but or what impact that can have on us. I mean, I think it's so often reduced, especially for those of us that straddle sort of research and development, but, you know, to sort of like a career disruption, you know, but I think it's so much more than that, you know, in terms of often redefining priorities and even redefining career trajectories. And certainly for me, you know, whilst feeling incredibly fortunate to have been able to have 2 children and maintain a professional career, you know, because of the supportive teams and people I've had around me, like, I think there's definitely been those moments where things just change in an instant because of circumstances that weren't by design, you know, weren't within control. And I think being flexible enough and willing to know that this is part of the journey, and actually this may end up, right now this is a challenge, but it may end up being an opportunity that actually shapes the next stage of my career. It's all a jigsaw that builds to you continuing to do what you love, is the way I see it. And so I think, you know, acknowledging that can be something that's really difficult, I think just, reflecting on how that's been.
I think that's an important career point for those who are, you know, young or just entering into this sector too, is that nobody really works in the international development, aid and development sector if it's not a passion, if it's not something you love doing or that you are incredibly interested in and are really wanting to do from both your heart and your mind, because there would be no point doing it thinking it's going to be a, you know, 9-to-5 job or that's going to land a hugely paying consultancy. It's just not going to happen. But yeah, you need to be doing it with an absolute love of the industry, of the sector, because that's the only way it works for you. I had one final question for both of you, I guess, as an overall question in terms of our topic, which was, you know, if we look back the 70s, if we go 60s, 70s, way back, if we go back, say, to the 70s, so aid then was driven by security concerns. We were in the middle of the Cold War. It was driven by security concerns and security around Cold War thinking, etc. So 50 years later, not to say we're not entering a similar thing now, but the world's just going mad. So I think we're all going to be in jobs for a while, the way things are going. What would you see are the main concerns when addressing the issues of foreign aid for development, and the role governments are going to play in that in this era? Given all the things we're facing, when we're pandemic, you've got Russia going nuts, you've got all these things happening, climate change, all these sorts of things. How do you see, from your roles, governments and us working with governments, how they see their roles in aid and development, foreign aid and development at the moment moving forward, do you think? Or is it a bit of a crystal ball question?
I mean, I think that one of the things that COVID, this pandemic, has shown us is how interconnected we are and how dependent we are actually on each other, and not just in a community within Australia, but in our wider region. And the increase in public support for aid, I think, is part of that. It's seeing that actually we need to support our neighbours, because we're not going to get through this pandemic unless we are all supported. And while a lot more needs to be done for and with our regional partners to make sure people actually have access to the vaccine and understanding about how to keep yourself safe and basically living with COVID as we transition into this phase, it's interesting that there's that drive. So I think it's going, what is going to happen? Obviously, it's a guess. But what I'd like to see is that actually does then influence continuing partnerships, and continuing to support local governments in developing their systems, in developing their education systems. And we'll see. On the flip side, Australia's white paper, which is what governs their, their foreign policy, is very much about national interest and security. And in times of conflict, you see countries bunker down even more. So from what I've just said to where we're entering now, it's a space I think that it's kind of, we could have a lot of guesses, but watch this space for what's going to happen.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, I think I don't really know what will, like, I don't know if I know what I think will happen or what they are thinking. I mean, again, I feel like I know what I would like to see, which is a real separation of that, right? You know, I think there's absolutely no need any longer to have our international aid all under our policy on national security.
So would you like to go back to an AusAid scenario?
I mean, whether it's back to an AusAid scenario, you know, or whether it's it's something, you know, brand new and visionary that was even better than AusAid is probably what I would like to see. You know, since we're being dreamers and our ambitions are high. I mean, I just think seeing a program that is absolutely driven by country priorities in the region over and above whatever other programs, you know, quite rightly need to still be conducted in the interest of national security. But like, I would just love to see a separation of those things in the future to ensure we are addressing local priorities and not smoke.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And of course, then we've got an election coming up, so it may all just change anyway. So we'll have to see about that. All right. So no more questions? No, but it doesn't mean we're over. You don't have this more drink. I can order more pizzas if you want. I just want to say at this point, thank you very, very much to Leanne Robinson and Karen Clark. Thank you very much for your expertise and your coming along tonight to have this discussion with us. It's been very good of you to come. We normally have a gift for our speakers, and Chris has said to me she'll mail them to me because she hasn't left me with any, and she's obviously in Sydney. So often she'll come down and do this, but we're trying to do a thing where she doesn't have to travel all the time, so I take the lead here. But she's not left me with any gifts for you, but she will stand with my promise. We have these really great mugs, Women in Aid and Development mugs, and so they are our gifts for our speakers, and they will be coming to you, I promise. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. So you want to thank Leanne and Karen, thank you. I should also say for those, I'm assuming we have quite a few regulars in the room, but then a couple of conversations I had early on was that there are a few newbies here. So in case you hadn't gathered, and I probably should have said it at the outset, I know Chris often does, is that, Women in Aid and Development is an organisation that is membership-based, so it's an Australian organisation, membership-based. We're basically here for women who, for support of women and women who are working or planning work, having careers in the international aid, development and humanitarian sector. It's about us supporting all women in this sector. We all love the work we do. It's not an easy sector to work in. But we look at this as being a way we support having the organisation and having gatherings like this to discuss topics that any of you are interested in. You're always welcome to email us with any topic ideas you might have, just to go through and give you that space and that area to talk for women in aid and development in the sector. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight. Like I say, don't run off. We've got more wine and I can get more if we need it, and I can get more pizzas if everyone wants. So thank you very much. Mingle, have fun, and thank you for joining us. Hopefully, not sure we've decided on a topic for the next one. We normally have our gatherings now that we can do them face to face, not just online, every 3 months or so. Yeah, we do try and do 4 a year. So, and if you're not here, there's Sydney and Canberra as well. We do them. Sydney's having theirs tonight, Canberra's tomorrow night, I think. But we pick a different topic, and every 3 months or so we'll have our meetings. So keep an eye on. Join up, please, but keep an eye on the social media pages and stuff and see what our next one will be. You never know. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies. It's really good. Thank you. Okay, get drinks. Does anyone want more pizza? I can order more pizza. People go stay.
I think they'll probably be waiting for the